In this podcast, we look at the challenges faced by food distribution across Australia. To expand on these challenges, we've invited IFDA CEO Richard Forbes and Activate Director and Head of Superior Sales Consulting, Mr. Jamie Lobina. Welcome, Richard, and over to you, Jamie.
Good morning. Thank you, Keith. Great to be here again today. And look, certainly would like to welcome everyone to our Activate Group Australia podcast series. Today it gives me great pleasure to welcome the CEO of IFDA, the Independent Food Distributors of Australia, Mr. Richard Forbes. Good morning, Richard. Hello. How you going, mate?
Very well, Jamie. Pleased to be here.
Fantastic. Richard, mate, I thought we should kick off with sharing with the listeners a little bit about IFDA and what you guys do and who your members are.
Well, it's really topical, the introduction that Keith gave about the pandemic. IFDA was really formed because, at the start of the pandemic, and it was primarily formed because a number of people came to the conclusion that there just wasn't an understanding within the political circles in Australia, whether that be state or federal, that a third of the food sector sort of wasn't recognised, understood, and a lot of education was required. And what I mean by that is that the majority of people, community and industry and business, all know the big two, the big duopoly that is Woolworths and Coles, but they really had no understanding of the role that independent family-owned food businesses played in this country. So we've had to spend a lot of time and effort educating people about what that role is.
Fantastic. And yeah, we will get on to the big two a little bit later. But actually quite topical is yesterday you obviously spent some time down in Adelaide. You got off a plane and you'd just been with the South Australian Premier down there. How did that go and your conversations with him?
The South Australian Premier is a very impressive man, I've got to say, Peter Malinauskas. I lined him up to speak to members he's someone that I hadn't met before. He's only obviously been in government as Premier for a fairly short period of time, but very impressive. He spoke to 400 or 500 food distributors and suppliers at the Adelaide Convention Centre. And what he did was actually, despite there only being a handful of South Australian distributors, he took the time to recognise those distributors and suppliers from all over Australia that had gathered in Adelaide to basically say, absolute congratulations for the resilience that you've shown in keeping food on our table during the last 2.5 years of the pandemic. And he understood all the issues, cost of living pressures, inflation, and he talked quite a bit because they have a very large independent supermarket sector in South Australia. He said, you guys really need to stand up to the big boys.
Yeah, I mean, South Australia is a unique state with, I'm not sure of the numbers, but it was close to 50% of the grocery market was independents a few years ago, and obviously he's still nurturing that. Richard, your other members, so you obviously, as the CEO of IFDA, you have other members as part of your association. Can you share who they are?
Yeah, so the three organisations, I guess, that founded IFDA are Countrywide, NAFTA, and the Distributors Group. And its primary aim, as I said earlier, was really to highlight to government that, all up, there's around 250, 300 warehouses out there, half of which are in the bush, that are servicing 60,000 commercial venues that make up the hospitality sector. But just as importantly, they also provide food to institutional facilities, and that's public and private hospitals, aged care, schools, military bases, prisons. So, there's a lot of important institutions out there that these independent family-owned businesses service as well. And so what happened during COVID is I got in touch with the Director General of Emergency Management Australia and said, look, you're having all these forums about the food supply chain. It's not just Woolworths, Coles and Aldi out there. There's a whole third of Australia's food sector that need to be recognised. Can we join the call? And it got to the point over the last 12 months where we've played a major role in educating, the 50 or 60 other associations and Treasury and industry departments about the role and contribution that independents make in this country.
And that's a really big point that you make there. I mean, Richard, you obviously, I've seen a lot of your interviews on ABC, Channel 7, Channel 9, Sky News. So you're getting a voice out there. Is it because, again, there's such a large market outside of Coles and Woolworths and Aldi that your members service? And is that something that you think, is coming to the forefront, and you're getting the industry's getting more recognition for that as a distribution system?
Yeah, there's two parts to that question, Jamie. The first, I guess, is that governments needed to understand during COVID that when you lock down the hospitality industry,
absolutely,
there's a trickle-down effect right through the food supply chain that affects family-owned businesses that distribute the food to those hospitality venues. And of course, suppliers provide food to the distributors who use their fleet of 2,000 trucks to distribute it into their hospitality customers. So just to understand the impact on the economy when you lock down hospitality. That's the first point. Yep. The second point, which I guess we seized upon, was the one about providing food to hospitals and aged care centres and so on. So when you talk about the impact of COVID and the transport of food and food provision, yes, you've got to take into consideration the community at large, but it also provided us with an opportunity to say, when you have close contact isolation rules for everyone, that means when one individual gets COVID in a warehouse and there's 20 other individuals that have to go into isolation, how do we get food to hospitals if the warehouse is shut down? Excuse me. So we spent a fair bit of time lobbying National Cabinet to say you need to change the rules for the logistics side of the supply chain so that we can get food, to the frail and the aged and the sick in those institutions that I mentioned. And within a week of publicising this in the Australian, National Cabinet made the decision to change those rules. So that was a great success.
Yeah. No, we had a similar sort of, challenge with obviously in the majors with food and toilet paper and everything else going off the shelves in COVID quicker than it could go on, that our members as fuel providers, filling those shelves were looked at and were deemed as essential services throughout the pandemic. And, that was a really important role that our members played across our sort of 10,000 staff members crossing the line every day. But back on the COVID one, Richard, really interesting. I'd love to get your thoughts on the impact of COVID outside of, the warehousing, more like the employment challenges versus the cost of service and obviously fuel prices now on the back of COVID and the Ukraine have gone through the roof. What impacts having to your members, mate?
Oh, it's having a huge impact still, and I think the one thing about the budget that really hasn't been tackled is rising input costs. We know about rising inflation, and you could argue, well, there's not a lot you can do about oil prices globally and the cost of fuel. But we got a whole bunch of trucks around this country transporting food, those truck drivers are paying anywhere from 230 cents a litre upwards. So what are we going to do about that, if anything? In the budget, they announced a 0.8 cents of a litre increase in tax on diesel. So that's not great. We've got huge increases in electricity, so energy prices. All of this is going to play out even more in the next 6 to 12 months. Rising insurance. I'll come back to electricity. It costs a lot to run refrigerated units in warehouses. So those prices, I've been quoted, average of $50,000 a month has now risen up to $70,000 to $80,000 a month. So, with food distributors operating largely on fairly small margins, any increase in the cost of operations is having a huge impact and will continue to do so. So I think the message from COVID is, yes, it was tough, but with all the geopolitical tensions, the natural disasters that we're seeing, it's going to be a very bumpy 12 months.
Yeah, mate, it is, and potentially even further. I was just watching Sky Business earlier in the week and talking about the UK market and transport, particularly fuel costs and electricity to transport goods, has just gone through the roof, and it's just creating a massive backdraft for unemployment as well, which is something we've experienced here. Your members with employment.
Yeah.
Is there any thoughts on that, and how do we change that, and can government play a part in that with employment?
So it's probably a good time to bring in the Food Supply Chain Alliance that that I helped facilitate. I guess I recognised that over the last 2 years, all the CEOs of the various food associations, for the first time, quite unprecedented, have been working really closely together. And that's been a great thing, because when you think about industry representative associations, largely we all work in isolation traditionally.
Yep.
But what COVID has done is, with all these task force forums and so on that the government's organised, we've all got to know each other. So we all recognised, about 8 or 9 industry associations in the food business, we're all suffering from the same thing. So why don't we get together and join an alliance to go to government? So we've formed the National Food Supply Chain Alliance. It exists of everyone from the National Farmers Federation, Australian Meat Industry Council, seafood industry, to the Refrigerated Warehouse and Transport Association, IFDA, so distributors, suppliers, and then right through to restaurant and catering. So it's sort of paddock to plate. And what we recognised was there were 3 or 4 issues we were all focusing on and that we were all being impacted by. First one, cost of business. I've talked about that. Second one, labour shortages. Third was we need to do something about competition policy so that the small guys can get protected. And then what are the learnings from COVID, and how do we look and redesign the food supply chain in this country? And I can talk about that later. But what we did on worker shortages, we all came up and we calculated that the total number of workers that we need right now throughout the entire supply chain is around 170,000. So 10,000 in horticulture, 5,000 in warehouses, distribution, 20,000 in independent supermarkets, 100,000 in the hospitality industry. We've all heard about the staff shortages there. And even in fisheries, the trawlers can't find staff, fish processing can't find staff. They need 5,000 workers in aquaculture in Northern Australia. So, it is a huge issue. And look, we addressed this before the Job Summit, and the government has made some commitments to try and speed up the visa processing time and so on and so forth. But I don't think there is really the recognition that the impact of worker shortages is having on our community. And of course, what that means in places like Australia and America. In America, they've had to go to four days a week to just distribute food. They're short about 12,000 warehouse workers and 30,000 truck drivers. And that's another huge issue here. I spoke to the Australian Trucking Association. They said there's plenty of people with truck licenses in Australia. No one wants to drive trucks. So it's another one of those issues that's labour shortage issues. We can't pick food when we do have floods like we've just seen in Victoria, New South Wales. Those crops are destroyed, but we still don't have the level of backpackers we had pre-pandemic. They were 140,000, they're now 40,000. There's so many jobs going around. A lot of those backpackers are staying in the cities and they're not heading out into regional areas.
Yeah, and that's obviously a backdraft that and backfill that's just not being filled. And is this part of this a cultural problem that's come out of the back of COVID, do you feel?
There's a lot of people, a lot of CEOs in the Alliance that are questioning whether people really want to work anymore in jobs that aren't that desirable. And the meat processing industry can't find abattoir workers. They can't get them to work in processing plants. So there's a little bit of a pick and choose mentality, and we have to try and make those jobs more attractive. But you're also competing with other sectors that are offering staff a lot more money. So, it's really difficult for our members because, they have to offer salary increases of, 4 or 5% upwards of what they'd normally pay, and they don't necessarily get the productivity gains. So we're in a bit of a bind at the moment, and I can't see any quick solution to this.
No, mate, not at all. And I might just highlight for our listeners that the Food Industry Alliance that you referred to, represents over 150,000 businesses across Australia, over $2 billion in revenue. $200 billion in revenue, and employs over 1 million employees across that sector. That is a big arm. That's a big voice, and it's great that you're obviously the figurehead lobbying that because society needs to know about it. The general person down the street needs to understand the role that you guys play in this distribution system.
Yeah, look, I think, Jamie, from an advocacy point of view, we all need to think about how we can get into a minister's door when the country is suffering so much from, a range of different economic factors at the moment. And I'll just quickly cover cost of living. The Food Bank Hunger Report came out Monday week ago and said that 1.3 million children in this country are food insecure. 3 million people living below the poverty line. It's extraordinary in the greatest country on earth to many, that we find ourselves in this situation. So in order to advocate, I think it's strength in numbers. And if IFDA, if I represented my small business owners of warehouses and I tried to get in to see the Minister for Small Business or Minister for Home Affairs, look, I'd have a pretty good shot because I'm quite well connected politically. But when you walk in with 9 CEOs representing 1 million workers, it's something that I think a whole range of different institutions need to think about, whether it be industry representative associations or whether it be the charity sector. We have 25 million people in this country and we've got 64,000 charities. So it sort of makes sense that if you really want to advocate well and get your views listened to and heard, whether it be through political meetings or through the media or whatever, you have to think about working together as a group and a strong group, because, as I said, strength in numbers can be really quite powerful.
Yeah, it can be, and that probably leads me to one of the questions I wanted to throw to you is, our members provide merchandising services again across all all walks of retail, from big grocery to independent grocery to crossing the line, and a lot of where your members cross the line as well. Do you think there's some, as you just said, collaboration that can go across industry for distribution systems to merchandising to warehouse?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think what COVID has done, and there's been a lot of negatives, but there's also been a lot of positives, especially when you think about how many cafes and restaurants and pubs and clubs and so on, just by way of example, had to up their takeaway offer, so we've all had to adapt. So as we move forward and we evolve, the opportunity for collaboration should definitely be explored. As both industries look to the future, suppliers may reach out to a merchandise company to help promote its products to cafes and restaurants. And that, could lead to new or improved orders for wholesalers. So, yeah, I absolutely can see opportunity. And, we have trade fairs in our industry where suppliers talk to distributors about the products that distributors might want to buy for their customers. But another way of looking at that, and it comes to your point a little bit, is perhaps food suppliers and distributors need to have strategy sessions about the state of the food sector in Australia and where it's going, and how we can all work collaboratively to increase revenue, increase our business, not just by those B2B discussions, but having a more high level strategic discussion about, both our industries, both our sectors, where we think they're going, what the future looks like in the next 10 or 20 years. So yeah. I certainly think the idea of more collaboration can only be a positive.
Well, maybe, Richard, that might come down to maybe guys like yourself and even myself to start that conversation after I spent, all the distributor members servicing Route, Impulse and petrol convenience around the country. I dealt with for over 20 years with providing turn-in orders and field support. So we've been there and sort of we've held hands at different stages. I think we could probably go the next step with that. But mate, look, interestingly, you said yesterday you didn't think we might get through 20 minutes. You didn't know what we'd talk about. But mate, I've got about 4 other questions, and I reckon we're nearly out of time. So, mate, I'm gonna throw to my last one, Richard. Just with your experience, your knowledge around this channel and dealing with this and the advocacy, talking to government all the time. What do you forecast as potentially one of the next big innovations for distribution that you can see potentially, and what would the benefits of that be?
Yeah, well, it has many dimensions, that question, doesn't it? And it ranges, I guess, from things like automation in warehousing, robotics, driverless deliveries, through to simple things like reducing emissions, so the electrification of trucks. And I know the Australian Trucking Association talked about that at their annual general meeting. So and delivery vehicles switching to hydrogen. There's all sorts of different opportunities, I guess. I'm going to put my representative hat on now, but if you're a family-owned independent business, and you've just been through the last 2.5 years, it's very difficult to think about with a bumpy road ahead for the next 12 months introducing automation and robotics and things like that, because they all come at a cost. And when you've been hit pretty hard, you've got to be very careful about your spend. So I'm not sure how quickly that will come in. I certainly think with there'll be more and more pressure to look at, the potential of electric trucks. People talk about, electric cars and so on, but they don't realise that I think 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles come from trucks. They don't come from cars. So maybe that's something we also need to look at. So, yeah, I think digitisation is another big thing that's being introduced into business, and then there's things like, it's one of those topics that we've all seen in the last month, and that's ensuring that you have the right cyber security, firewalls and all those sorts of things in your business, because, if you can hack into the big corporates, well, small to medium-sized businesses are also vulnerable. So cyber security is another issue that I think a lot more businesses are starting to think about.
Yeah, mate, absolutely. It's very prominent in all our lives across business, and even down to our own credit cards and fraud there. Richard, mate, absolute pleasure. It has been great to catch up. It's flown by as they do. I'm sure we may even get around to re-chat maybe in 6-12 months and see how some of that advocacy is coming together and some of the lobbying that you guys are doing. You're doing a great job, and certainly, again, knowing the distributor members for over 20 years, I know that they certainly, having someone like you representing them, a fantastic thing. So look, I was going to throw over to Keith just to say, Keith, is there anything you wanted to add, or any questions for Richard, mate?
Oh, firstly, Richard, I'm fascinated with the depth and the discussions that you've been having against these issues that you face as an industry. And there are certainly a few things that have cropped up in there that I think we should have further discussions about as far as that collaboration proposition. And certainly one of the strategies we have as a business is to look at running seminars to highlight various things in the industry that need a lot more discussion. And one of those that's coming up fairly soon is disabilities. And certainly we're looking at things like nutrition as well. And if you take those, then there is obviously crossovers that we can have between our different organisations. But certainly from the Activate Group Australia's perspective, we would like to talk with you a great deal more on the Food Alliance that you have, and also the opportunity to have more input from your side into the industry report that we produce every couple of years, twice a year. So from Activate Group Australia, brilliant. Appreciate it very, very much, the efforts you put in and the work you've done with Jamie this morning. Thank you.
My pleasure, and thanks for the opportunity, guys.